Hello, my name is Neil Davidson and I'm the founder of Raw Armor Studios. Welcome to another online portrait drawing session. This session mimics the structure of a regular life drawing class. We'll show you 3 photographs on the screen, one for 10 minutes, one for 20 and one for 30, and it's your job to draw the image that you see. Lizet will be joining us today. She'll be doing a demonstration and giving hints and tips. You can either follow her advice or do your own thing. It's entirely up to you. Once it's finished, don't forget to post your photographs on Instagram and hashtag them with hashtag #RawUmberLive. Right, let's get started.
Hello everyone and welcome to another Raw Umber portrait drawing session. Today I will be going through all the basics. My materials you can find in the description box below, but I can tell you now I will be using a charcoal pencil and a putty rubber. Putty rubber is great because you can mold it into several forms and it gives you great precision. Make sure that your pencils are sharp or your charcoals or whatever you're using. Finally, I will also be using a brush, and this is just completely optional. You can also use a Q-tip for this or a paper stump. And it's just to sort of blend and help with making everything smooth. Okay, so let's get started with the actual drawing. So for the first pose, we've got a very easy sort of straight on, he's looking to the right sort of pose. And you can see he's looking up, and you can see this by several lines. So for instance, you've got the top of his head, you can see that's angling up. You can also follow the arch of his cheekbone to the bottom of his eye, so sort of like the ear hole to the bottom of his eye, that's also arching up. And finally the bottom of his chin is also arching up. So those two lines, the top and the bottom, are the ones that I'm going to use to make sense of the top and the bottom of the box that I'm about to draw. For the front plane of the box, I use sort of an imaginary line that goes from his chin to his brow, and then another one behind him. And the box is really useful because it sort of simplifies everything we do. And that's really useful because, of course, there's so much going on. You need to make sure that you could somehow grasp it in easy steps. The next thing I will do is draw a cross through the whole box, and that will be the midpoint of that box. That's sort of where his eye would be. The corner of his eye is sort of, if you measure it, it's midway. And it's also where his ear will be behind. So an ear always sits at that halfway point, but just behind it. And you can see, if I measure, that's the halfway point. So you don't have to draw the cross in, but it is useful just because it's a quick way to just get the dead center. Another place where this midpoint gets really useful is because it's also the start of the jawline. So as you can see in the picture, the jaw is always just before the ear. So that midpoint is really quite important. If I follow the corner of the eye back, you can see that is also the bottom of his skull. You can see it sort of sticking out there. And these sort of measurements are universal. Everyone has got this. Everyone's ears in the midpoint, everyone's back of the skull is behind that midpoint. Everyone's jaw starts just before the ear. So these points are things that I will use in every portrait drawing. The next thing I'm going to do is divide the face up into 3 thirds. And these thirds will be bottom of the chin to bottom of the nose, bottom of the nose to top of the brow, and top of the brow over where sort of like the hairline would be. And again, this is pretty universal. Of course, everybody's got slightly different proportions, so that's something to take into account. But my goal is to, for now, just draw a human, and then we can make it into him in the longer poses. But I just want to give you a sort of structured way of figuring out the main proportions of a face. And like I was saying, of course, the box is a complete simplification, and he's not actually square. So what I'm going to do is look at how the front of his face deviates. So something that's very common in most people, you'll have the brow to the top of the hairline sort of receding, and you can imagine a sort of angle going from that straight line. Or you can simply lay your pencil across and figure out what that line is and then take it onto your paper. Next, of course, the nose sticks out. And finally, for his jaw area, I see that if I just sort of look at the line from his brow to his chin, I can see that the lip area sort of sticks out. So I'm going to make that a bit more protruding than I would normally. And this helps a lot with the lightness as well, because for everyone it's different. Some people have a more protruding sort of lip area, some people have a receding chin. So this sort of stuff helps a lot. Now we already know where the brow is, but we don't know where the ear is yet. So the ear is generally centered between the bottom of the nose and the top of the brow. And for those of you who watched my drawing portrait video on aging, you know that the ear is actually a bit lower on older people. But in general terms, it's going to be between the brow and the bottom of the nose. And for those of you who've watched a few of my videos before, just see this video as a bit of a recap of all the stuff that you probably have heard me say a million times. But I think it's good to just do a recap of all the proportions every so often. Next, I'm going to draw in the eye socket. Now, the eye socket is very, very important. For those of you who've done the skull video, you already know the eye socket a little bit. But for those new today, I'm just going to show you the general shape of the eye socket. So as you can see, his eye is not as far forward as I placed it earlier. It's actually a bit further back. And you can see it's sort of angled. It's not straight. So the brow is further forward than the bottom of the eye. Now with the mouth, you can divide that lower 1/3 into 3 more thirds. The top one will be usually the lip area, and the bottom one will be where the chin starts. Now I see he's got a slightly lower top lip, so I'm going to place that a little bit lower than that general measurement of 1/3. And I just for the bottom lip, I'm not going to draw that in. I know often the instinct is to give the lips some color because you think, of course, they're a little bit red. But if you actually look at the lower lip, there's not that much color on there. It's because the light sort of hits it. So instead of drawing in the lower lip, I'm actually going to draw in the shadow shape underneath. And then finally, we have his lips sort of sticking out. And you can see that his lower lip, in his case, sticks out a little bit further than his top lip. Now we've got the lips in, let's break down the eye socket a bit more. First, I check the size. So the size of the eyebrow and the general eye socket should be 3 times the size of the whole side plane from the front brow to the beginning of the ear. And that seems about all right. So I'm going to start putting the eyeball in. Now the eyeball sits quite smugly in the eye socket. So I just draw a little circle where I've placed the front of the eye, and then I just make a little V for the general lids. And that's pretty much enough for the eye socket for now. I try to just have a little bit here and draw a little bit there and try not to get everything perfect the first go. It's better to have structure and slowly start building up than jumping into the details straight away. Okay, so that's it for the 10-minute pose. Let's move on to the 20-minute one. Okay, so here we are for the 20-minute pose, and I just want to continue giving a recap of all the basics for those of you who are new, and of course for those who are doing a few portraits already. Now, when you're drawing, make sure that you hold your pencil at the ends and not draw like you would be writing. And the reason for this is because it's much easier to make nice straight lines, as you can see, when you hold your pencil at the end. So try to get in the habit of that. Now I've just placed the top and bottom, and then I'm just going to find that midpoint and the 3/3. And just as a little side note, the reason why I like using straight lines is because they're much easier to control and they are much more descriptive. So a circle is just always a bit of a circle. If we draw his head as a circle, it's going to look a bit fake. But as you can see, the top of his head's actually a few straight lines. So it's better to use as much straight lines as possible. It just gives force to your drawing rather than having curves everywhere, which can look a little bit generic. At the moment I'm drawing in the center line, and the center line is very important. It's the line that goes from sort of in between his eyes, the brow line, to the tip of his nose, to the middle of his chin. And that is the line that basically goes for the center of his face. And we're going to use that as an important point to measure from. For instance, if I place the tip of my pencil at my point where I've put the bottom of his nose and my thumb at the bottom of his chin, I can take over that measurement and see that it's exactly the same as his cheekbone to the center line. And this is called comparative measurements. And this is really, really useful because it means you can draw it in any size you like and still all the things relatively to each other will click into place. So I'd really recommend you do measure quite a few things just at the start of the pose so you know that everything's roughly in the right place, and then just draw freely from there. Now, everybody's got a slightly different head shape. So in his case, he's got a hard head shape, which means that his forehead is wider than his cheekbones and his cheekbones are wider than his chin. So I'm going to place that. I know where his cheekbones are supposed to be, and I'm just making his forehead a bit wider and his chin a bit more narrow. Now remember how that lower 1/3 that we measured is the bottom of his nose. And also remember how I said that the ears are always below the brow and above that bottom of the nose. Now in this case, they're a little bit lower, and this is because he's slightly lifting his chin up. So I'm first going to place them there and then lower them slightly. And I might need to still change these positions later, but I find it just so helpful to just put something down and then go from there. And I generally try to work from that general point of view to the more specific later. And this helps me get rid of any small errors at the start. Now going into his mouth area, again, we can measure that and make it into 3 equal thirds. And then draw in a shadow for his lip. As you can see, his top lip is in shadow and the lower lip is actually in light. So I'm not going to place anything there. And instead, I'm going to draw a bit of shadow just underneath it, just to indicate that lower lip sticking out. And I can use this to measure from again. So for instance, that sort of jawline, you can see it breaks. And if you look at it horizontally, it breaks just about where the chin sort of starts. So going across, I know that's where it sort of starts breaking, and then I can indicate that with a nice strong line. And when I do that on one side, you got to do it on the other side as well. So it's very important, especially with the portrait that goes straight on, that everything is symmetrical. And this will also come back in the last pose, which will be a bit more tricky. So always aim for that symmetry, even though you sometimes don't see it very well, or maybe it looks like his chin is actually a little bit more to the left. Try to aim for that symmetry. You can always put the more specific little changes in later. Now, moving over to the brow, you can see that generally there's a ridge all along his brow. And you can follow his eyebrow sort of curving around with the face. Now we also know that the bottom of his eyes will be at the halfway mark. And when I look at how many eyes fit into his skull, that's 5 eyes. So going from the corner of his eye to the inner corner of his eye, I can see it fits 1 time on the side, 1 in the actual where the eye is, 1 in between the eyes, and 1 and so forth. And now I know where that is, I can start drawing the eye socket in. And I like to start from the center line and looking at that sort of triangle of the brow, and then working my way out. And again, this is another likeness thing. Everyone has a little triangle over the brow, but some people's brows are a little bit more flat, some people's are more arched. So another little likeness thing. Make sure that the brow ends before the side of the head starts. You can see there is some space, about 1's eye width space, between his ear and the start of his eye socket. So make sure that's in there. In the meantime, if you have any questions, let me know in the comments. I'm here to answer anything you are having trouble with. But in the meantime, I'm going to start going for vertical measurements. So I'm going to see how the corners of the nose line up, and I see them lining up with the corners of the eye, so the inner corners of the eye. And this helps a lot with likeness. Everyone has a different sort of nose, so some people will be wider, some people will be more narrow. So it's useful to look at these sort of vertical measurements. The corners of the mouth are another place that you can look for with these vertical measurements, and I see them lining up with about 1/3 of the eye. So not quite halfway, a little bit more towards the center. And like I said earlier in the video, his head's not actually rounded, so I'm going to put those straight lines in that describe the planes of his head. For the neck, there are 2 big muscles that are very important. They are called the mastoids, and they start from behind the ear and they go to the pit of the neck. So I always draw those in first. And now we've got a pretty general, nice structured head, and now we can start putting some detail on top. So let's start with the eyes. Now it's very tempting to draw the eyes in great detail from the start. And this is because socially we're very unique animals. The sclera, or the white of the eye, as you can hear, it's white. But in most animals it's actually brown. And scientists, as far as I know, make sure to correct me if you are a scientist and know more about this, think it's because it's a social thing. So we communicate a lot with the eyes. So of course, as you draw a portrait, you want to draw the eyes the most detailed. But I'd say hold off, because putting too much detail on early on in the drawing can really predispose you to some mistakes that then will haunt you for the rest of the drawing. So again, working from big to small and trying to hold off on that detail. With the eyes, what I try to do is I know already where the corners of the eyes will be. I've indicated those earlier, and what I'm going to do is just follow the ridge of the eye, or the ridge of the upper lid. The upper lid's the most mobile and the biggest, and usually has some shade at the top and quite dense lashes, so it's a lot more easy to see. So usually when the person is looking straight on, the highest point of that upper lid will be about 1/3 on the outside of the eye. Now, of course, he's looking to the right, so that means that we have to get where the iris has to be. So again, I just draw in that general eyeball and then place the iris on top. Now, this works for the right eye. But for the left eye, when we place the iris in that same fashion, the eye shape of the top lid doesn't quite work. And this is because when you draw an eyeball, the iris actually sort of sticks out like a little sphere on top of the bigger sphere. So that means that the lids sort of poke out more where the iris is centered. So in this case, instead of the high point being on the far outside edge of the left eye, it's going to be also on the right corner of that eye. So basically the lids sort of follow where the iris is. Now again, it can be quite tempting to draw the eye and draw the lower lid because you think it's encasing that whole eyeball, I must draw it all in. But actually the lower lid's a bit like the lower lip, is not actually a line like the top lid is. If you look at the lower lid on the left, for instance, you can see it joins up with the rest of the skin. So instead of drawing the lower lid in, what we're going to do is draw the shading below it later on in the drawing. And a very good example of this is Loomis, his eye example. You can see the difference between two round, drawn eyes and just two almond shapes. It just doesn't look like an eye. So try to just draw the top lid only and try to look at spheres rather than just drawing the outline which you think an eye should be. Now, when looking at the nose, there are also some shapes that everyone has. The tip of the nose will be further down than the middle of the nostrils, and then the nostrils sort of curve under again. So it's a sort of a up, down movement. And the nostrils themselves will drop a bit further than that tip of the nose. And again, this is universal. Everybody more or less has this. The way the tip of the nose drops down and how deep, that's more unique to the person themselves. Now I want to talk to you about drawing generic lips as well. So with the lips, generally what happens is the tip of the lip, so the philtrum, sort of comes down. Then the lips themselves sort of slope down gently and then pick up again and get horizontal or even turn up at the corners of the mouth. And again, this is just a generic sort of lip. In him, they're a lot more flat. The philtrum doesn't come out quite as much, so it doesn't come down quite as much, but I'll start drawing that and adjusting that. I just want to sort of show you how to draw a generic lip and then going from there and making it a bit more like him later on. By the way, if I'm speaking a little bit too much and you've heard me say all these generic rules before, feel free to mute me and just draw along at your own pace, of course. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is the shoulder girdle. Now, the shoulder has a very important muscle at the top, and some of you who may already know this, who've done my back pose a few weeks ago, and that is the trapezius. And the trapezius joins up visually at the back of the neck. So when you're drawing the shoulders, always make sure that they connect together. If you have one shoulder way higher than the other, it just looks a little bit odd. And from there you can draw his sort of clothes on top and the rest of his neck. And for those of you who found this interesting and actually would like to know more, I can really recommend Bern Hogarth's book, Drawing the Human Head. You can order it on Amazon, and he just really explains all the features and how they work. It's a really good book. So now I've got everything in. I'm going to do some corrections. So of course right now I've drawn a very generic head. So I'm going to do some measuring. So for instance, I see that his forehead has grown a little bit. Of course he's looking up a bit, so that means that we don't see quite as much as his forehead. So I'm going to do some general correcting of stuff and try to make it look a little bit more like him. Next up is the shading stage. Now this is optional. Some people don't like to do some shading. I like it because it gives a lot of information about the space around the face. So for instance, when we shade in the left half of his face, we can see that the light is coming from the right. Now I will get more into this in the 30-minute post, but for now, just ignore anything in the shadows or in the lights. So for instance, you see a bit of light reflecting back into the shadow on the far end. Just ignore that for now and just focus on how does that shadow start? How does it relate to the side of his face? For instance, we can see a really clear little shape underneath his eye for the cheekbone. That says a lot about the way his cheekbone is shaped. And there's some shapes around his chin that say quite a lot about his chin. So those are the things I'd focus on. When you're shading, make sure to use even pressure, hold your pencil at the end and lift up your pencil after every stroke. So I start my stroke and lift up and I start my stroke again. And this gives a nice even sort of coverage, whereas if I go back and forth, it can get a lot more uneven in pressure and uneven in texture. And this might take some practice, but I would just say give it a go and see how it goes. And what I like to do finally is I use the brush or the stump or the Q-tip just to sort of work that into the paper. Now, as you can see, this pose is a lot more tricky, and I'm going to introduce you more into my box method. Now, for anyone who wants to know more information, I do have a box method video on the YouTube channel, but I'll just take you through the basics. So we're going to start with the center line and just focus on what we just did in a 20-minute pose, just focusing on that front plane of the face and looking for those main measurements. So top and bottom center line first, and then looking for that midpoint and the 3/3. Now, one thing that's going to be different, of course, from the start is that the nose sticks out to the right. And this is the first thing I'm going to draw. Because if you have a 3/4 view, one thing that your brain likes to do for some reason is turn the face towards you. So it's very hard to make sure that the far away cheekbone is small enough. So I'm going to start by drawing the wedge of the nose in. And then I'm going to look at the space from the tip of his nose to the side of his cheekbone. And I'm going to try and measure that correctly, but also keeping in mind that my brain might play tricks on me and I might not get it completely right. So again, working from general to the specific. And you can also use some comparative to measure up. So for instance, on the far away cheekbone, we see it's about 2/3 of that lower 1/3. And the other cheekbone will follow that general rule of it being the same width from center line to the cheekbone as the nose to the bottom of the chin. And now we've got that, you can imagine that sort of general box shape for the front of his head. One thing that I do want to mention is if you have stuff like the brow line, the nose line, all of those lines, make sure they are all going in the same direction. So I see the line of his eyes kind of going up. Make sure that everything is going up in that same way. So his brows, bottom of his nose, and even his mouth. Now we've got to join up that side plane with the front plane. And the first thing I'm going to do is measure how wide it is. So looking at that width of the cheekbone to the center line, I think it's pretty much the same as the whole side plane, so the whole plane in shadow, from the back of his head to the corner of his cheekbone. And I also see that it's going down. And the way I can see that is I look at the corner of his cheekbone to the ear hole, and you can see that angle is going downwards. So we know that that whole side plane is going down. And this method can be a bit confusing at the start, but I'd really recommend you give it a go and just see how you get on, because I find it's really useful to have a sort of good system to draw a head rather than just drawing freehand, because the structure of a face can be really, really important. Now with the ear, we can just follow that sort of line of the side plane and again place it below the brow line and above the nose. And then we can start rounding off the skull. And going for the outline, we can see really clearly how that eye socket goes inwards and then the cheekbone sort of comes outwards. Now, of course, if it comes out in one side, it needs to come out on the other side again as well. So keep looking for that symmetry. And remember what we did with the 3/3 of the mouth and that angle of the jaw. So when I've got the 3/3 of the mouth in, I can look again, that jawline breaks at the start of the sort of chin area, and make sure that it breaks on both sides in the same place. And of course we know where the jawline is. As I said in the 10-minute pose, it goes straight in front of that ear. And that's also where the mastoid starts, which just starts just behind the ear and sort of goes towards both ears. And of course then we have the shoulders, which should just sort of imaginarily connect just behind that neck. You don't have to draw that whole line across, just sort of imagine the two lines intersecting. And like I said, if this is a little bit tricky, I know it's a tricky pose, so you're doing well for sticking with it. I do have that video of blocking in the head that might be useful. And otherwise, if you really want to get into the basics of drawing, I do have a finished bar course on a subscription service. If you happen to have the subscription, that might be useful because I get into materials and how to hold your pencil and that sort of stuff. So that might help as well. And now just drawing in the eyeballs again and making sure that I just draw the top lid and looking where that top lid, that arch is the highest. And again, following his iris. And I'm going to jump to the shading part of it quite quickly just because I want to get into some finishing stuff with you for this pose. But feel free to keep on the measuring and the figuring things out a little bit longer if you need to. Now again, it can be quite tempting to get into the different shades you see in the shading and his jawline and his ear, but try to imagine that the head is just a box and the front plane is getting the light and the side planes are all in shadow. And that's the most important bit of information that we're trying to sort of get down on the paper. The head is sort of a box in space. And again, I'm doing some blending. Now, when you're starting to blend, feel free to go over the lines a little bit more when you're getting to the front plane of the face. So as things turn, you can see, for instance, if you compare on his forehead, the back of his head is very crisp and clean, but the shape of the shadow near his eye socket is actually quite soft and a little bit blended. Now, I've drawn it quite sharp just for structure's sake, but feel free to start blending this a little bit more. And as I hit the stage, I'm going to continue to correct the drawing. So what I generally use as a rule for myself is when I add some information, I then have to go back to the drawing and do some correcting and making things more specific. So I've just added some shadow and now I'm going to go back onto the outline and clean up my sketchy lines and try to be a bit more specific about where I want everything to be. now the drawing is really quite specific, but also has lines everywhere. So another really good challenge that I'd like you to try is see where you can get rid of some lines. So for instance, our brain likes to think of stuff like touch. But if you actually look at his nose, there's not a line that separates his nose from the cheekbone everywhere. So try to get rid of it in some place. And as you can see on mine, you don't actually need that line everywhere. And this is used everywhere in logos and that sort of thing. So if, for instance, if you think of the WWF logo, little panda, you know it's a panda, but actually it doesn't have a line that outlines all of those little shapes that make up the panda. So this sort of illusion is what we're also trying to do in the portrait. So try and see if you find place in the outline or in the nose or in the eyes that has a line at the moment but actually doesn't need one. Now for the very last stage of the drawing, I want to get into edges. And edges are basically the transition from the shadow into the light. And sometimes this is soft, sometimes this is hard. So for instance, when we look at his nose, we can see there's a shadow being cast by the nose on his top lip, and I'm going to harden that up. But then the shadow side that is sort of transitioning into the tip of his nose, I'm going to soften up. And the reason for this is that one is a cast shadow and one is a form shadow. So just drawing a little shadow on the corner there of my paper, I'm going to show you the difference between the two. Now when you have a form in space, when the light's coming from the right or from the left or wherever, it will hit the object and the object will at some point turn away from the light, and that's why there's shadow. The light's not directly hitting the object anymore. And this is called a form shadow. It's caused by the form of whatever you're looking at. Now underneath it, you also have the cast shadow, and that's the shadow that's being cast by the object being in space. The cast shadow is usually really sharp where the object starts and then sort of fuzzes out as it gets further away from the object. The form shadow will be softer the rounder an object is. So if something is very round, it will get really soft. If something turns away at a more than 90 degree sudden angle, it will be really hard. So on his face, nothing is gonna be turning away quite that suddenly. So most of the form shadows will be at varying degrees of softness. So let's see how this works on him. So I'm using my brush, but you can also use the Q-tip, stump, or even your finger to blend in the edge of the shadow that is the form side of it. And again, don't worry about stuff inside the shadow, just look at the edges of the shadow. And you see when I do that, the nose starts turning round. We visually perceive it as turning round. And this is what we do all the time when you're looking around objects. You don't know how it's going to feel, but we do see how the light reacts to it, and our brain connects the dots from there. So we're going to try and get that same illusion in our drawing. So I'd say go around the drawing and start looking for cast shadows that should be hard. So for instance, his eyebrow is casting a shadow on his eye socket there. And form shadows. So for instance, the left side of his left eye that's turning away, that's a form shadow. As you can see, this is the point where the drawing really slows down. And what I'm just doing is really getting into the detail and looking at the edge of that shadow and just hardening bits up and then softening other bits. And in the meantime, also doing some drawing correction. Now, as always, if you have any questions about this, do let me know in the comments and I'll try to answer them as best I can. Same thing with the lip. We can see the corners of his lips, really soft shadow, and then at the bottom of his lip we see a really harsh line. That's the difference again between a cast shadow or a form shadow. That's the end for the 30-minute pose. Thank you so much for coming and well done for getting this last tricky pose right. For those of you with subscription, as per request, we're doing a hand session next Wednesday. I'm really looking forward to it. So I hope to see you there, and otherwise hopefully see you next Sunday for the next portrait video.
Thank you for taking part. I'd like to thank Lizet for joining us today as well. Don't forget to photograph your work, post them on Instagram and hashtag them with #RawUmberLive. We run 2 sessions a week, a figure drawing session on Wednesday evenings at 8 PM and a portrait drawing session on Sundays at 2 PM. You can see our website for more details.